Welcome to Cloud Dialogues. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Welcome to Cloud Dialogues, everyone. We are so lucky to have Liz Fong-Jones with us. For a while, Matt and I have been thinking a lot about SRE, and it's definitely something that I would say when I think about all the different topics of cloud, it's one of the topics that I am not so confident with. We're super grateful for Liz to join us to talk about SRE.
And
Excited to be here.
and that's where I'll say, welcome, Liz. I kind of know Liz mostly from her work around big in the graviton space, very passionate about sustainability and higher performance for less money, ideally. But I'll
We all
let
want that, right?
exactly.
Yeah, right. Like it's funny. I've just been some kind of a performance and reliability wonk for the past 20 years.
Always squeezing the
Love it.
most performance that you can. How about give us a quick summary of where you came from and what you do today?
Sure. So today I'm the field CTO at Honeycomb. We are a Series D startup, about 200 employees. I've been in Honeycomb almost 6 years now, which is an eternity for a
Oh,
startup.
that's a long time.
And before that, I was at Google. I was a site reliability engineer at Google for 11 years. Um, And before that, I did a bunch of different stuff, working in game studios, doing consulting, kind of all kinds of interesting little projects.
Yeah. Um, I my early career, I came back. Did you do sysadmin as well? I like to think.
I did, yes. I started at Google before I had my bachelor's degree, actually.
Uh,
So Google hired me because of my system administration work.
yeah, I like to think that, which may or may not be right, but SRE has a lot of history in the sysadmin type world around automation, that sort of thing. Do you want to just give a brief sort of background on how SRE came to be? Actually, were you around at
Yeah,
Google
I
when
think
it
this is
came?
so fascinating because we were talking about SRE being a cloud subject, but really SRE predates the public cloud. SRE was kind of this creation of Google in terms of Google realizing they needed this is before I started at Google, but Google realized that they needed a different approach than hiring an army of sysadmins to stare at the dashboards and manually correct things because you can't really wait for someone to intervene when Google web search goes down. You have to have automated remediation, you have to have automated scaling, all of those kinds of things. So this was probably in the 2003, 2004 timeframe that Google kind of came up with this idea of what if you took a software development mindset to systems operations, right? Sure, you would hire system administrators, but you would also hire software developers into this space that had traditionally been viewed as, software operations is the domain of sysadmins, right? Like, why would any software engineer who was proud of their own work want to work there? And Google kind of turned it into one of this very much in demand fields.
Yeah,
So I mentioned one of those key tenets being treating automation as crucial, which has a lot of parallels with the DevOps movement as well, with automation being kind of one of the key pillars of DevOps. So these kind of were two movements that evolved in parallel. Google realizing that they needed a better way to run large systems at scale, and people in the DevOps world realizing they needed ways to bring agile to software operations. I started Google in 2008. I wanted very much to learn how to run larger scale systems. I didn't have a computer science background, but I did have a extensive background in systems engineering or systems administration. And it really taught me a lot about how to run these larger scale systems. And then the public cloud came along and companies other than Google and Facebook, now Meta, Pinterest, right? The companies of all kinds started needing SREs. That's kind of how all of these things Google encountered that need early on. There are many other programs that were similar in terms of DevOps programs. And then kind of the name that we converged on having for this kind of work is SRE today.
yeah, and DevOps kind of, yeah, it was a parallel thing, and DevOps is more cultural, right? So
Right?
and
Like you wouldn't
practices.
hire someone with a title DevOps engineer, or at least you shouldn't, I
Yeah, I
would
know.
argue.
Executives who are listening,
Whereas
please remember this. DevOps engineers
yeah,
are
like
culture.
it pains me to see a DevOps department, to see people titling themselves DevOps engineers.
Yeah,
But yeah, it does result in some confusion, right? Because, when you hear the term SRE, right, you can think of site reliability engineer, the person, right? Like the person working the job. You can think of site reliability engineering, the discipline. You can think about the department. Do you have a team of site reliability engineers? Right. Like there are so many, and then you can talk about the practices and culture of SRE, right? Like, and these things do not have to be implemented all together. It just happens that, there's this one word that we use that can be a verb, can be a noun, can be an adjective.
Yeah. And you don't really get sysadmin jobs these days, right? It's always it's
They exist,
they
right? And honestly, I do not think SRE is for everyone, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah,
if you
yeah, that's kind
have
of
a
what I was going to
product
ask.
that is stable in terms of its surface area, is stable in terms of user growth, there's no reason to hire SREs. You can have a team of sysadmins run it. You can outsource the operations, right? Like, that's fine. The place where SRE really excels is where you have both high rate of new features being delivered and where you also have extreme needs of scale, of increasing, escalating
Right.
needs of scale.
But you don't have to have both. It could be like one or the other, right? I mean, sometimes you might have
Ideally,
both.
both, but yeah, certainly I think it's a blend, right? Depending upon how much of each you have, that kind of dictates how much you really need to embrace SRE versus it's a choice that you can make.
What about, Liz, what about where you've got applications that are really critical, say they're critical national infrastructure or, significant banking operation, but they are quite stable in terms of growth? Is there a need for SRE in those types of environments?
You say that they're stable in terms of growth, but experience shows that to not be the case. If you look at the debacle that was the US effort called healthcare.gov,
Oh,
right? That
yes.
was a situation where they needed to roll out in a registration for national healthcare, for national health insurance. So they basically had a few months to build it since Obama announced it, Obamacare. And then they had a few weeks to actually debug it when it actually launched and flopped. And that was a situation where the people who were brought in to fix healthcare.gov were experienced SREs, people
Yeah,
like Mikey
right.
Dickerson, Carla Geiser, right? Like, those were the folks that knew how to work with complex systems and restore
Yeah,
them to working operations, right? So you may think that your systems are nice and stable, but the reality is we live in a world where technology is empowering everything. People critically rely on technology to exist in our society, to access
yeah,
benefits, and that the needs for that are going to be subject to fluctuation, right? I'm sure that the Internal Revenue Service has had consulting from the Chief Technology Officer of the United States, right? Like, and from their office, right? Because you get these spikes around April 15th, the US tax filing deadline. I don't think
Mm.
there is such a thing as a steady state system, even a critical government system. In the banking world, we see the same thing. One of my clients that I work with is one of the major banks in Australia, and they've been expanding and marketing this mobile first banking application, right? Like, that you access only with your cell phone. There is no fallback to go to a branch if there's a problem, right? Like,
Yep.
yeah,
and that means that yes, it's a banking system, but they have a very large team of SREs, and they're really, really great SREs because they recognize this is mission critical for them, and they need to innovate. Like, they need
yeah.
to add new features, they need to deliver to make it a compelling offering.
Yeah. And they're great examples because you don't have to be a hyperscaler to have these needs, right?
Right,
No,
it used to be, but I think the thing that the
It's
public cloud
changing.
did was that it kind of made the compute elastic enough so that then you could build
that it
software
needed,
applications that
yeah,
also could
Yeah.
could
scale out.
scale so dynamically. Yeah. And
That
I guess it depends how much of the estate you're talking across as well, right? Are you talking about one application? Are you talking about a estate of 40 applications? And then how do you, that's where I wanted to ask you as well, in terms of how you structure SRE or how you think about SRE as an organization, what are the different kind of extreme variations that you've seen in terms of how that's implemented or managed successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah, let's talk about the thing to not do, which is do not take the Google SRE book as your Bible and then copy it into your organization. You are not Google. You have very different organizational incentives. The state of the industry has evolved since 2003, 2004 when Google SRE was conceived. And
Yeah,
even Google doesn't practice everything in the Google SRE book
what they
consistently,
said.
right?
Yeah.
So I think it's very much a thing to tailor to your individual organization. I think the other practice that we're seeing is that SRE is no longer kind of a standalone organization, that we've
Yeah.
realized that SRE is subsumed as part of a broader platform engineering effort, that we are all here to facilitate developer productivity, to facilitate developers building things the right way, whether it be from a reliability lens, a security lens, a build systems and release engineering lens, right? We care about these things together, and therefore we kind of approach this as, oh, we're reliability special snowflakes, right? Like,
Yeah.
we need to really join with the people who are doing accessibility and join with the people who are doing security and the people who are doing testing and dev productivity, right? But yes, there is a spectrum of adoption. Once we've kind of talked about the obvious pitfalls of don't just carbon copy a Google S3 book, right? I think there are a couple of things to look at, right? Number one, what are the practices you're implementing? And number two, how are you implementing them? The practices you're implementing, I think that your organization is not really doing SRE unless you are doing kind of these two critical things that are kind of the key messages I would take away from the Google SRE book, right? That we view the idea of minimizing toil and embracing automation as kind of one of the key things that you have to do, or else you're not really an SRE team, you just rebranded your systems administration team, right? If human beings are putting out the flames by hand every single time, that's not an SRE org. Because what we do in SRE is we reduce the kind of amount of manual work or toil to, and we kind of say you should be spending no more than 50% of your time doing manual work. Because if you spend more than 50% of your time doing manual work, you don't have the time to automate away the manual work, and the share of manual work grows over time. But if your manual work is less than 50%, ideally like something like 20 or 30%, then you still have enough information about what the manual work is to be able to usefully automate it. And you are spending enough time paying down that technical debt by writing and maintaining that automation. Makes sense. So I think that's kind of one of the key tenets. So you can imagine there are a variety of different ways to implement in terms of who does that automation work, in terms of where they sit in the org, but I think that's kind of a key thing that you have to do. And the second thing that you have to do in terms of reliability being in the name SRE, right? Like if we have to track and manage reliability, not just reactively, but proactively. Right?
Mm.
A well-functioning SRE org should be tracking and owning our service level objectives, right? To say, this is the level of reliability we're targeting. Here's how we measure it. Here's what we're going to do if we don't meet that level of reliability, right? So I think those are kind of the two key practices to implement, but there are range of ways to implement it, right? You can choose to have a small number of SREs that are part of a platform engineering team. And the platform engineering team is rolling out these tools that every software developer in the organization uses, right? Like that's kind of one model is kind of the tools-based SRE approach. You can have the kind of consultative SRE approach where you have SREs that are not necessarily part of the platform team, but they parachute in to help individual teams that are in trouble or getting off the ground or something like
Like a
that.
shared service.
And then there's the embedded SRE model where you say every team is going to have SREs on it, right? This is the model that Facebook did is every Facebook development team of any substantial size has production engineers, their SRE on it, right? Like, so the overall thing though is you have to have a community of practice, right? You have to have the set of people who are doing SRE work, talking to each other and sharing best practices, right? Lest they kind of drift away from each other, drift away from the SRE principles, lest they kind of succumb to the, congratulations, you're the one production engineer on this team and we're going to make you do all the ops work because you're good at it, right? Like you kind of have to have some mechanism to push back against that. It doesn't have to be you have a dedicated set of managers for SREs or production engineers. It does have to be like you're talking to each other, you're norming and kind of figuring out what does it mean in our organization? How do we make sure that we're kind of keeping reliability and maintainability as those kind of North Stars?
Obviously, culture is going to be important. However you decide to implement that, the way that your culture is, or however your culture is changing is going to be very influential on how that works or kind of doesn't work, right? But what are some of the things that, there's some things that you've seen in terms of really driving that culture of like, I guess, accountability, but also transparency with the teams? If you've got shared services, for example, everyone's going to need to be talking to each other. And if they're not, then it's going to be really difficult for them to be effective. What are some of the things that you've seen that work well in terms of really driving that culture?
So I think there are both top-down and bottom-up ways to approach it. I think let's start with bottom-up first. So I think that you need to hire SREs that have curiosity and empathy. You can teach the technical skills, but kind of curiosity about like what's going on here, being and willing to say, "Oh, that's broken, but don't worry, we'll just never press that button." Right? Like, that doesn't fly with an SRE who's curious. But I think, as you're saying, right, like empathy is kind of the other key thing because there always are going to be far more software developers than there are going to be SREs, right? So the only way that we can really drive the change that we want is to work through other people. And that means being able to persuade them to do things that improve reliability practices and keeping reliability a priority, which you can only do if like people are bought into this idea that, should we slow down when we have too many outages? Yes, we should focus on doing remediation work, right? You as an SRE cannot single-handedly drive down that remediation backlog. Like you have to work through other people. And also, there was a very famous Google SRE who was known for saying the word no to everything, right? Like, and I don't think that's something that we should aspire to. We should aspire to help people get to yes, right? Yes and yeah, yes, but instead of no period. I think the top-down aspect is we have to make sure that as leaders, we are cultivating a environment of psychological safety. We have to make sure that people feel comfortable escalating and raising concerns, that people feel comfortable pulling the end on cord and saying, like,
Yeah.
no, right? Like, we are not meeting our targets for reliability. We need to slow down, right? There can't be any retribution for someone saying that. Otherwise, again, you don't want SRE to become this rubber stamp machine or, the people who do your grunt work, right? Like we kind of have to have that healthy balance, and that healthy balance comes of setting healthy boundaries.
Mm. And that's important. And that's why the business needs to be on board, right? Because it's the whole
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, you can't
organization.
just rename your SRE department, right? Like, you can't just say, "By the way, we're doing the SRE thing now," right? I think a lot of why we see successful adoption of SRE is often coupled to change in leadership, where new
Mm.
leadership wants to bring in new ideas, wants to change the operational model, and has the political capital to kind of carry that through because they were brought in as the leader for a reason.
Yeah. We talk a lot about cloud strategy and cloud transformation on this show, and it feeds into that because you've got to have that
Exactly, right? Like, so
buy-in.
cloud kind of creates that demand, right? Like, hey, we are adopting cloud. Okay, why are you adopting cloud? You're adopting cloud because you want to move faster.
Scale.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you want to move faster, right? Like, don't you want to move faster and safely? Right? Like, okay, right. Like, that's why you might need
Exactly.
SREs to help shepherd that change, to help realize that kind of goal of this is the outcome we're trying to achieve by moving to cloud.
Yeah, I've
You
worked
don't
in
just get there by, moving to cloud. You don't just get there by creating an SRE department. Right? Like, we always need to focus on what's the objective that we're trying to achieve here.
yeah, I've seen that organizations going hard on automation, but then automating so fast that everything breaks fast as well. So
It's like the poop machine.
exactly.
You get you would produce foods faster.
It's not
Who among us hasn't had a Roomba go berserk?
I would liken this to when you educate your whole organization about cloud because you want to drive demand for cloud, but you have no demand management in place. Therefore, it fails because everyone wants something that they can't have because there's no mechanism in place to actually facilitate that.
Yes, indeed. We've seen all sorts of things, and it's not great. Around reliability, can we just talk about SLOs and SLIs for a second, just so people understand their role?
Yeah, I talked about it earlier, right? Like, in terms of just broadly speaking, that we need to have a mechanism of measuring and proactively managing to reliability. Blech. The term that Google SRE came up with for this is the idea of a service level objective and a service level indicator. So you may be familiar with the service level agreements. That's kind of the
Yeah,
legal terminology of, if you do not meet this expectation, I will pay you money. But it turns out by the time you get to that point, you've already damaged customer
it's late.
goodwill, right? Like,
Yeah.
you should be setting internal management safeguards that are, well away from those SLAs, that you're never in danger of breaching your SLA. That's why we have the idea of a service level objective, right? Like, it's our internal target. There are internal consequences, but not external consequences around it. So we might say, internally, our SLO, for instance, our SLO at Honeycomb, is that 99.5% of the time that querying our service is going to be fast and work correctly, right? Why 99.5%? Because, you could always hit retry on the query, right? Like, it's not a situation where we only get one shot to get it right.
Mm.
Or one-way
Um,
door.
so setting a realistic expectation, not 100%, also super, super crucial. But, that specifies what the target is, but doesn't specify how we measure it. So kind of to get to brass tacks about, what does it mean to be fast and reliable, right? Like, so that's where we get into the service level indicator, which is concretely, how do you measure your service against that expectation? So for us, every incoming query that we get is measured against the standard of, does it complete in less than 10 seconds? And did we return any errors due to incomplete data, right?
Mm.
Like, data not being accessible, a query worker timing out, something like that, right? Like, so that is our SOI, right? Like, our service level indicator is setting a concrete threshold of 10 seconds, zero failed shards, right? So when you roll that all up, right, then we can say, zooming out to the flow now, right, like 99.5% of queries that are SLI eligible should be successful. And why did I say eligible? Because it turns out Your health checks, right? Like those are not necessarily representative user workload. Your friendly neighborhood person who is over quota and is being rate limited, like that shouldn't count
Yeah.
against you for reliability, right? Like, so you kind of have to massage it and say, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what does success mean? Funny story. My sister-in-law is a nurse in Australia. And I was explaining the idea of an SLA and SLO to her, and she was like, "Oh, you mean a KPI?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, exactly, right." Like, so they have a KPI, for instance, that when you arrive in their admission room, right, like it should take no more than 3 hours for you to be seen
Yeah.
to, right? Like that's literally an SLO there, except for it's in the framework of a hospital and not in the framework of a software service. But it's that kind of same concept of we have targets that we strive to, and we take corrective action if we do not meet those targets.
Yeah. And can those SLIs be, I mean, they can be metrics that make sense for your particular context. They could also be
They
business
can be,
metrics, right?
although there are some kinds of metrics that I kind of discourage for SLIs, right? You can, if you are really, really, really used to this idea of I have my time series and you'll take them away from my cold dead hands, right? Like if you really are in an environment where the only thing you are measuring is your 95th percentile latency, right? Like, yes, of course, you can say out of all of the 5-minute windows in each month, there will only be 3 5-minute windows that have a 95th percentile latency of more than 5 seconds. Sure, you can do that. The problem is it's not very granular, right? Like
Mm.
for one, it only gives you 3 single missed windows and you've blown your SLO. Number two, it's silent about what happens to the 5% of queries that are slower than your 95th percentile, even during a period of time when your SLI is met, right? This is kind of why we really, really strongly discourage kind of so-called good minute, bad minute school of thought around SLIs. Some people like find good minute, bad minute SLIs and SLOs helpful, but we think that it's really, really coarse and that you're much better served using actual user transactions as your barometer for setting an SLI and an SLO.
Mm.
Because I mean, if you've got a bad 5 minutes during your most busy 5 minutes of the day, that's not great, right?
Exactly, right? Like it's a lot worse to have your 95th percentile latency blow out on Black Friday
But
or
it won't
Singles
be
Day than it is.
representative. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly, right?
Okay.
So it has to be weighted by the number of
Love that.
transactions, which at that point, why not just measure transactions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Matt, I think the only other thing, and tell me if I'm wrong, the only other thing that we got asked about was the intersection between, I think you touched on it before we started recording, is the intersection between SRE and FinOps. How do we like find a balance? Like, what did we say? How did you put it? The most performance for the least money.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily for the least money, right? Like and it's not
reasonable
necessarily
cost.
the most performance, right? Like we're when we're talking about reliability, right? We're talking about what good enough reliability means, right? Like you
For
should
what you
not
need.
engineer your 2.5 nines storefront or like news website to be as to be as reliable as calling 000, right? Like
5 nines availability.
yeah, so right, like, it depends on are there life or death consequences to this, right? Like, similarly, I could invest 2 months of time in squeezing out 0.1% performance out of my service. Is it worth it? No. Right. So I think, yes, cost is a dimension of the sustainability of your business, right? Just the same as revenue is an important component of your business. So when we think about cost, it's important to make sure that you are keeping costs to a low enough level that you can sustain doing your business and that there's kind of a plan, right? If you are going to invest a month of engineering effort, right, you'd better be, saving at least, I don't know, 5%, 10%. Well, it actually depends on the size of your bill, right? Basically, it's how much does your engineering salary cost? I think in terms of FinOps, the other thing I think about is what would my service reliability be if I spent, infinite money on, I don't know, providing everyone with do you remember Iridium sat phones? Like the big clunky things that, right, like what if we had to provision every user with an Iridium sat phone so that even if the cell phone network went down, they'd still be able to access our service? My
Yeah.
service would be 100% available
Yeah. But you'd
until
be
the day
broke.
that I
At what
stopped being able to
cost?
pay the bills, and then it would be 0% available, right? So I think that's an important thing to think about is like, what's realistic for us to
What
achieve
availability do you
given our
need? Yeah.
reliability and financial constraints, recognizing that
Yeah.
financial constraints are part of reliability of being
Mm.
able to afford to deliver the services.
What sort of like mechanisms can be put in place to like balance those two things?
So the thing that I love doing is if we have set a goal for reliability, a target for reliability, if we expect only 1% of requests to be slower than 2 seconds or whatever, that enables you to then say, okay, how many resources can I take away from the system, right? Like almost like playing Jenga, except where you've got the magic undo button to put the pieces back in, right? So let's take pieces out of this Jenga tower until it's about to fall over, and then we'll hit the undo button and put a few pieces back in, right? So the SLO really enables you to say, how few resources can we get away with and still run according to our service level objective? So that's in fact, so, Matt was alluding to why is it that Honeycomb is so invested and interested in technology like ARM and Graviton? The answer is we want to meet our service level objective at a minimum cost, both in terms of people and in terms of system resources. So we've set these targets. For instance, we say 99.99% of the time, a individual payload injected to Honeycomb should take less than 5 milliseconds to ingest, right? So I can just go and swap over to the Graviton architecture and start taking away machines until I breach my SLO, right? And then I'll put back machines, right? And that tells me how little can I get away with, and therefore how much better is this instance generation versus the previous instance generation.
Hmm.
So it's a mechanism of keeping our margins and our cost of goods sold protected, while also treating reliability as the primary thing that our customers are paying for.
Does this feed into the cost of downtime and error budgets and that sort of thing? Do we
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think there's this question of how many replicas should I run, right? And my answer to that is, have you actually tested your disaster recovery strategy? It doesn't matter whether you run 3 copies of everything. If it turns out that you've got this one hidden dependency squirreled away that's single homed, that if you take that out, it takes down everything, right? Like it's like,
Fail
right, why did they
anyway.
pay for all this redundancy in the first place, right?
Mhm.
So we actually on Honeycomb blog published recently a set of blog posts about actually simulating on a Friday. We actually, and not only simulating, we killed every AWS instance running in one availability zone. And we prevented new instances from starting up into an availability zone, and we wrote it out. We proved to ourselves that our redundancy was doing what we expected it to. Paying to store the data 2 different ways, or actually, I think in total, each copy of data coming into Honeycomb is replicated to five different times over, right? So we've kind of got a myriad of disaster recovery strategies, but we showed that that strategy worked. That we don't need to increase to 10x redundancy, that our existing 5x redundancy is enough. Being able to test stuff like that empirically is a lot better than saying, in order to be safe, I have to run extra copies or I have to have this wasted resource. So that also let us see, when we take away one of our 3 availability zones, how much does traffic surge in the other 2? Right? Which then lets us say, okay, now we know this is the amount of slack capacity that we need to maintain to be able to tolerate that surge, right? You can have executives that come on down from up high and say, oh, you have to be multi-cloud, or, oh, you have to have 60% utilization or 30% utilization, right? Like, where's that 30 or 60% number coming from? I think it boils
Right.
down to what enables you to safely ride out any event that's accounted for in your durability plan.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very good tips there. Very insightful. I've seen a lot of execs come out with weird numbers all the time. And it's like,
Yeah, but I think, right, like that, you have to start with having a realistic SLO, right? Like to
yeah,
say, we are going to target 3 nines, 4 nines, maybe even 5 nines if your situation is like calling 000, right? But it has to be commensurate with the value to society generated and the cost of actually achieving that, right? So when we start off by setting realistic reliability expectations, then we can work backwards and say, how should the system be engineered to meet those requirements with a minimum of cost?
Yep.
Accounting for the cost of the expected downtime from the safeguards that we chose not to implement because they would cost too much, right?
cool. Do we want to close off with maybe just some final thoughts on top tips for executives who want to actually implement SRE? What things they could do to sort of start things off?
Yeah, I think it's first important to think about what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's the broader change that we're coupling this to, what outcomes are you looking to achieve? I think then you kind of can start looking at, and yes, it is a very competitive hiring market for SREs, even with people doing layoffs. I think the reality is the really good SREs get snapped up right away. So recognizing what capability do you have to hire SREs. I think today, if I were starting an SRE org from scratch, I would make sure that was part of the existing platform org, right? That those folks were adequately supported. You need to make sure that people are empowered to do their jobs, that you're providing them with strong executive support and saying, yes, like you need to set an SLO. no, you can't just keep on developing features if you breach your SLO. I think it's important to think about helping people set those SLOs in the first place, right? You have to think about, how am I going to explain the cost of this, of adding this set of people to your leadership or to your board, right? So I think there has to be that kind of concrete outcome of, previously we didn't have an idea of whether we were up or down. Our teams were getting alerted all the time. Our developers were burning out because they were getting paid null hours, right? You have to then be able to say, we brought that under control. We now have an idea of where we stand in reliability. We've got sustainable on-call, right? Like the SREs are fostering the right cultural practices, right? Like this is what this investment has meant.
Yep.
And maybe it doesn't mean hiring SREs, right? You can teach software developers to be on-call for their own software, right? I think that's fine, as long as you're coaching them in the right ways.
And you provide the right tooling and support and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Tooling.
Right? To kind of plug my own company briefly, right? I think this is why observability is a key part of this, is that setting us and managing to them requires you to have good production data. It requires you to have the ability to effectively debug and to effectively be able to correlate user outages to telemetry about those failures so that you can set things right. So yes, I thank you for giving me that segue of, giving people the right tools. I think if you are not giving people good observability, you're really kind of hobbling your SRE team's ability to be effective.
Exactly. And I mean, we could do a whole show on observability, but yeah,
I
observability.
feel like most organizations don't have the right data.
Yeah.
Or they're just squandering it. They're just putting it into a ill-shapen data sinkhole rather than
Yeah, they just have
structuring
a
it
big
properly.
pile of logs and some metrics, and that's it. And that
And there's not actually any sort of understood mechanism to deal with that.
exactly. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for your time, Liz. We really appreciate it. It's good discussion. We covered quite a lot in that time. And
So
It was
much.
a
I
pleasure.
think we covered off everything. Liz, before we close, is there anything that you want to give a plug? Because I know you have a bunch of different projects and initiatives.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure, as Matt mentioned at the start, I am a proponent of AWS Graviton and of the ARM ecosystem. So if you're interested in saving the planet and saving yourself a couple of bucks, more than a couple of bucks, look into using ARM processors, whether they be Google's Axion, whether they be AWS Graviton, or whether they be the ARM Ampere processors, right? Like there are just such a variety of ARM processors that are much more ecologically sensitive and also are better price performance. The other one is, I only have the traditional Chinese in front of me as a prop, but this is the
love
observability
it.
engineering book.
Yep.
So
That's
feel free to pick up a
awesome.
copy of that.
I've got
Because
one
it kind
here.
of has a lot of that wisdom of how to run observable systems with good SLOs.
How good.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners
Awesome.
for the questions.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was awesome.
And
Feedback?
feedback at cloud-dialogues.com or DM us, Georgia or me, on LinkedIn or wherever. Everyone knows how to contact us. We're not hard to find. See you next time. So thanks all. See you. Goodbye.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.